Okay, hold on just a minute. There we go. I opened the wrong editor. I'm sorry. Apparently my brain, whoosh. Okay. You want editor E, not X. I'm not sure if I said that backwards or not, but
Oh yeah, you did.
so let's reverse that.
Okay.
E is the one you want.
Okay.
I apologize. But you got to see what the interface looked like on the other one, I guess. Okay, so here we are where we're supposed to be in Pixlr E. And like I was saying, checking for exposure, where you're going to find that is in the adjustment. So when you go to the adjustment, there's two ways you can explore this, curves and levels, if you remember that a little bit from last time. So levels tends to be a little bit easier to start with. Curves is a little bit more advanced, but you can fine tune it more. So starting with levels is great. So if you look at this, so this is great. This is much better because if you remember last time when I pulled an image up, I was like, oh, it's good exposure because, you know, I had taken the photo and shot that exposure. Well, this one looks a lot different. So if you can see, you've got a black arrow, a gray arrow, and a white arrow. And then falls.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is information about the photo, information about its lights and its darks. Now, if you look at this particular photo, if I said to you it sort of looks maybe like faded or grayed out a little bit, would you agree?
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the information, that makes sense. The information is all in the middle, in the gray areas. So what that tells me is there's not a lot of really dark darks, and there's not a lot of really light lights. It falls kind of boop in the middle. So what happens if I take this black slider and move it toward the information?
Mm-hmm.
That made my darks dark. And then if I take this slider, the white, and move it towards the information, I can start to pop out my brights.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, having a photo faded or sort of grayed out is a look. It's like a filter, it's a style. So perhaps the photographer of this photo edited it to be that way. But maybe you don't want it that way. So this brings a lot more life and color back into it. So look at the before and after. So this is kind of cool. You can hold this down. So here's before, here's after.
Wow.
Right? Just from sliding with the levels. That's it. Does that make sense about how I kind of found that information and slid those two sliders?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now you have this gray slider. The gray slider allows you to kind of customize it. Like maybe you want to make you want a little brighter. So there I bumped it up brighter. Here I can push this darker. So you can slide this one around and just make it how you like it with this little gray tool. Okay. And then the red, the green, and the blue, these guys you can play around with to tint and to tone. So if I pull the slider away, I can cool this off a little bit. See how that looks more cool now? Mm-hmm. Whereas if I slide this to the left, I can warm it. Mm-hmm. So it's a way to kind of just, again, tint and tone your photo to give it a different temperature, essentially. So again, I can cool it, warm it, and again, I can see my before, and there's my after. Yeah. So pretty simple, right? With just some little sliders, and you can do quite a bit of adjusting there. So typically when I edit a photo, no matter if it's a landscape, a portrait, animals, whatever, I start there. I always look. And you can customize like I said, because sometimes you want things to be grayed out or toned down or this or that. So you can play with those sliders and customize. It's just kind of understanding like where to begin and what the sliders do, I think. So some other things I do, if we zoom in a little bit, now I think she's very lovely, right? So I'm not going to critique her too much here, but let's just kind of nitpick, and there's some things we can do. So for example, little stray eyebrow hairs, maybe some little skin imperfections. Right here, she's got a wisp of hair coming down.
Uh-huh.
You know, there are a couple little itty bitty clumps in her mascara that we could remove if we wanted to. Again, if I'm being nitpicky. Oops.
Huh.
Even like little eyebrow hairs right here. You know, and as women, okay, we notice those things in ourselves, right? It's like we got the mirrors and we're like little hairs, this and that, and we notice those. So
Yeah.
we get one in a photo and it shows up. There's lots of little tricks we can do to get rid of it.
Yeah.
So the first thing is this little Band-Aid tool right here.
Hmm.
Okay, so this little Band-Aid tool is basically like a little magic tool. And I usually start here, and it usually fixes more of the minor things. So of course you have a size right here, so you can size this. I typically do zoom in when I use this. But if you're looking, like right here, there's like a slight little blemish right there.
Mm-hmm.
So if I click right here, it's gone.
Wow.
Okay, so same kind of little thing. Even this hair that's kind of going down here. If I click, 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 getting rid of it.
Wow.
I can also make this a little bit smaller then to get in closer.
Yeah.
Okay, and then get rid of that. Little random eyebrow hairs, I can click and get rid of those.
Oh, that's nice.
You know, just like little things. So if someone, you know, sometimes we get blemishes, right? It just happens. And if you get a blemish on photo day and you just want to edit that out, you can just use that little Band-Aid tool. It's like a magic spot heal. And so I usually start with little things, things I've used it for, like I mentioned, random hairs, blemishes, little spots, imperfections that bother you. I've even done it for sometimes like there'll be a random little splotch of color or something, or a sun flare that's weird or random. You can pop it on that and it'll usually get rid of that. So it's good for minor things. Let's do a major thing. See the hole in this leaf?
Yes.
Let's say I don't want a hole in the leaf. I want to fill that in. Well, the Band-Aids isn't going to work too much for that because it's a little bit bigger, it's more involved. So I could use the clone tool. So it looks like a stamp, and it's basically you're copying an existing part and you can place it over the part you want to cover up. This is the tool you can use to remove unwanted people, objects. You can take things out with this tool, and you can actually add things back in or manipulate with this tool as well. This tool is very versatile. So when you click on it, you're going to notice you have all these settings up at the top. The two or the main settings you're going to need to know are the source and paint settings. Source means this is what you're taking a picture of. So source is almost like a little camera. So if you hover over the green, when you have this little cross and you click, I just took a picture. And when I took a picture, it then changed it to a circle with a little crosshair. Now, when I take that circle with a crosshair and click, I can duplicate what was.
Nice.
Isn't that neat? So that's what you can do to fix big things or get rid of something like a random street sign, or Like, for example, I took a wedding photo once of the couple. They were sitting in the car, but in the background, there's just this one street sign, and it just like ruined it. So I used this tool, and I copied the sky, and I clicked over and just made it look like it was gone. It was just sky in the background.
Nice.
So it's really a neat tool for those types of things. I will tell you, it can be very involved sometimes. I've spent hours with this tool with like little monotonous things. But typically when I'm doing like portraits, I don't use it for as big of things. I use it more for maybe landscapes or maybe groups of people, and they're like, oh, you know, that person wasn't supposed to be in this or something like that.
Yeah.
And then up at the top, you of course have a brush size, and you get pretty advanced with the brush here. Softness, of course, refers to the edges of the brush, of how like soft the edges would be. Like if it's 0%, it's a really crisp edge, which tends to look not so natural, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Whereas if you soften it a little bit, it kind of fades and blurs out the edge, which to me, like skin or something like that, tends to look a little bit natural. And then step, this is kind of interesting. This is like the spacing. So imagine, okay, if you click and hold down the brush, it's like spacing between it. So it's almost like if you put a big step between your brush, it's almost like you're painting in polka dots.
Oh.
So why would you want this?
Yeah.
I don't really know, to be honest with you. But there's a lot of settings in here that I'm really not sure about just yet, because it's such a massive program. So, but just that's what that is. I usually keep that pretty low because I don't want much space. But then of course you have all these shapes too. So sometimes painting with a random shape with the clone tool helps it look more natural too versus a circle. So one of these other kind of bursty shapes, it's almost like giving you a cross hatch texture. So yeah, things you can play around with that brush.
Oh.
Then you also have opacity, which is how heavy or opaque that's going to be. So if you wanted to sort of fade something into the background, you could sort of use the opacity tool. And then the align, you know, I haven't messed with this much, but what I think this would maybe mean is it just kind of helps things mesh more, maybe? I'm not really sure. I'd have to play around with that a little bit. But yeah, does that kind of tool make sense then, the clone tool, kind of how you'd use that for different things?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, it's neat. It's a neat tool.
That is a neat tool.
Okay, so the next thing that I think is important to know is your selection options. So you have the wand select tool, and you have what's called a lasso tool. So these type of tools, what you could do is select something. So let's say, for example, you want to make the eyes brighter, or you want to change their color. I don't know, whatever you want to do. And the eyes, just a nice, easy example. And you can zoom in. And of course, keep in mind when I zoom in so much it pixelates, of course, you've probably experienced that.
Right.
But, you know, even if it's a little pixely when you're zooming in, sometimes that's still helpful. So Magic Wand, when I click, it tries to auto-select based on sort of the contrast. Tolerance just means how much it will try to differentiate between the colors. And then your feather is how much your edges are sort of softened. So I usually like to put a little feather on there again, because a crisp line just doesn't look so natural to me, depending on what you're doing.
Right.
And then over here you have some modes. You have an option to add to your selection or remove from your selection. And it also says you can use Shift or Control to do this as well. You're clicking. So if I want to add, so it didn't pick up this part of the blue, I can add and click. Now it picked up so much more than I actually wanted, right? One more. So I can try to move my tolerance down a little bit, and then I can remove. Okay, there we go. So when I remove, it starts to get rid of some things I don't want. Okay, so that's one option. And I can deselect all that. The other option is your lasso tool, which I actually like a lot better. So you can freehand a lasso, which I'll just show you is me just drawing with it.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I like the magnetic lasso. The magnetic lasso is kind of a smart function that it tries to grip onto the lines as you click. So I like to feather just a little bit, like I mentioned. We'll try like a 6. And then I click, click, click. And as I click, it's basically making a little connection.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's kind of, it's a smart function, but I still have some control over it. So I like this tool for that purpose. Okay, and then when I get to the edge, it then
Closes
for me. Exactly. So let's say like I don't want the pupil in there. I just want the iris, the color portion. I can click here and remove. So what I'm doing right now is removing this from the selection, so this won't be part of it anymore. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now let me see. Okay. So when I get to this point, now, of course, I could make my selection a little bit better. I'll be honest with you. I've spent a good portion just selecting. A good chunk of time selecting is what I mean to say. So sometimes that happens. But I'll just keep this loose for the sake of this kind of example. But what I can do is go up to adjustments, and I have a whole bunch of things I can do. I've got temperature and tint, hue and saturation, vibrance, color balance, brightness, contrast. I can play with a whole bunch of things when I get in here. So let's just take a look. We'll take a look at some of these different ones in a minute. So hue and saturation. I can change the color of the eye simply by sliding this. And then I can pull it back this way, get some green, yellow. And would you want to have this color eye? Maybe not, but
Looks kind of evil.
just, but, you know, to me, maybe it's like you'd want to maybe just bump up the natural color slightly. I don't know.
Yeah.
Saturation. Again, I can have highly saturated, or I can pull this down, which low saturation translates to black and white.
Right.
So with that being said, you've maybe seen images that are selective, some black and white, some color. You know, I think of an example like a black and white wedding photo, but the flowers are in color or something like that. That could be a way to achieve a look like that. We're selecting something and lowering the saturation essentially. And then lightness, of course, I can make this really light, which again, kind of looking crazy. Or I can, you know, maybe you want a deeper eye color or something like that. I can tone that down a little bit. And of course, you can see here's your before, here's your after. So you can always see that before and after. So that was that one. Temperature and tint. Temperature is just, it's going to be a little bit more subtle. This is just, of course, warming it or cooling it. And then tinting it, I can give maybe a slight tint. It's maybe kind of drastic still, but yeah. And again, before, after. So I'll apply that, see what that looks like. And then I can deselect that. And totally, and there you can see the two eyes then.
Yes. Yeah.
But I mean, fairly convincing, right? I mean,
yes.
You know, the person, it's one thing. You're like, your eyes aren't actually that color. But if you're just sort of playing around with another photo, can be sort of a fun thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, let me see. So I talked to you guys a little bit about the liquefy tool last time. This is where you can do some of those kind of funny enlargements
Oh, yes.
or different things. But you can also do some like purposeful things with it too that's not like necessarily crazy. Like, you know, you're probably not wanting bulgy eyes or swirly eyes or things like that. I typically don't do that in my portraits, but you know, you can do all sorts of things. But this push tool actually can be helpful sometimes. And the reason why is you can sort of move things with it just ever so slightly. And this is, again, maybe a silly example because you probably wouldn't actually necessarily want to do this. But okay, so the direction of this leaf right here, I can
Mhm.
use the liquefy tool and like change that. I could take it, click on it, and pull it,
Oh.
manipulate it, or say, add some bumps. You know what I mean? So I can slightly change things. And again, why would I want to do that with the leaf? Who really cares? But you know,
Right.
there could be something in the photo that you want to do that with, or to just move something. Could be a hair is looking out of place or sort of funky, and I've moved hair or pushed. You know, there's just been little random things that I'm like, oh, I wish I could just move that or shift that slightly. And so
Mhm.
that tool will allow you to do that. So that's maybe a more purposeful thing for this one rather than, again, some of the funky things you can
What
do.
is that tool called?
This is called the liquefy tool.
Oh, yeah, liquefy. Okay.
Liquefy. So
Uh-huh.
again, like this is, I can make, you know, the pupils bigger.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, that doesn't look too crazy, but
Yeah.
there you can make it pretty funky looking if you if you want
Oh,
it.
yeah.
Let me see. There we go. Zoom out. Yeah, that still looks fairly natural looking, and I almost feel like, I mean, you could kind of get away with the eyes. Again, I don't know this woman, so it's like you could.
Different.
Okay, so some other kind of tools to show you, and I've talked about a little bit about these before, but the dodge and burn tool is a really helpful tool for lightening and darkening certain areas, because sometimes we take a photo and we do the levels like I showed you in the beginning, and it doesn't like solve every issue. There's still maybe a part that's too dark because of a shadow, or a part that's too light because of the sun came in a certain way. So that's why the dodge and burn tool is helpful. And you've got lighten, darken, and then it allows you to play with ranges, meaning the shadow area.
Uh-huh.
So any area that's really dark, your midtones, of course, all your middle ranges, and your highlights, meaning the really bright areas. So you can select if you want to lighten or darken those specific areas. Then you have a brush, of course, which we've talked a little bit about the brush already. Size, and then strength is like how intense the tool is being used. Like imagine like sometimes you want something to just be lightly dusted or something, or sort of sprinkled on. That's maybe the best way to explain that. um, you know, maybe you imagine you're applying blush on your cheeks and you want just a light bit of blush because you don't want to look like
Yeah.
a clown. So you can sort of imagine it like that, like it's the strength of how much it's being used, like the pressure of it in a sense.
Uh-huh.
Um, so like to lighten an area, let's say, I mean, again, this is a really nice photo. I wouldn't actually need to maybe lighten this area, but let's say her cheek, I just felt like this is a little too dark. I can
Mhm.
sort of click, this is like lightening way too much, but I can basically paint with it and it lightens. And if you want to undo something, you can go up to edit, undo, and it will remove, and you can keep undoing things. Or you
Oh,
can hold Control Z. or I could redo by Control Y. So you can see I put that dot back on her cheek right there.
Uh-huh.
But if I do Control Z, it removes it. Control Y puts it back. Control Z removes it. So that's really nice because you can try things, and if it doesn't work out, you can undo it.
Nice.
Yeah, that's if you just kind of click and hold, it will just gradually lighten all together. So again, that's the example of that being lightened. But again, I wouldn't actually need to do that there.
Yeah.
So I can undo. And then same thing with the darken. Let's say I, felt like, oh, this is too light.
Too light. Mm-hmm.
I can just paint and kind of darken slightly. And again, it made it really, really dark. So what I could try is maybe less strength.
Uh-huh.
Just undo what I did there. So I can try like less strength. Just put.
Oh yeah.
Just do it ever so slightly. This is maybe better, ever so slightly, and I can just darken some areas, lighten some areas. So that tool can be helpful. This tool, the sponge color tool, this is sort of like a selective color tool. So you've got two modes where you can increase or decrease, and then you have some methods. Vibrance, like how vibrant or luminous it is, like sort of like brightness. Saturation is kind of like how intense the color is. Low saturation, like imagine, okay, think of green. Low saturation would be like your olive army green, whereas high saturation is more like your lime green or neon green, like the brighter, intense greens. And then temperature, of course, is your warms to your cools. So again, let's just use the eye for an example, because I think that's, a nice pop of color where we can see. So let's say I want to increase the vibrance. I can take a look at my brush, same kind of thing, mess with the softness. I think soft is kind of nice, play around with the size. And then I can just paint. Like it's not doing anything. Well, maybe my strength is just not enough. What if I bump this up? Maybe it's so subtle. There we go. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's still pretty subtle.
It is. Oh, there you go.
It's funny because it's like similar to Photoshop in a lot of ways, but then there's some things that are different. There we go. So yeah, you can play with the string. So how this one is going to work is, it looks like kind of clicks, individual clicks.
Oh yeah.
And again, not that I'd actually want to do that particular thing, but so I can undo that a little bit. Saturation, brighten that, increase saturation, decrease saturation. I'm sorry, I told you wrong. Saturation is your black and white.
That makes sense.
There we go. So anyway, again, not that you'd want to do that, but just things you can play with. And again, that's your sponge color tool. One thing too, I think is nice to look at is the crop tool. There's some things I didn't understand about the crop tool, like when I'm choosing to crop something. And I've talked about in photography how I try to always crop as much as I can when I'm looking in the viewfinder, but that just doesn't always happen, especially if you're snapping a photo quickly and you get some extra stuff in the background and you want to crop something out. I mean, I still crop. It's not like cropping is a bad thing. It's just something I was taught in school about composition, and an artist's eye is being mindful of framing when you can. But in the situation where you need to crop, I'm always kind of like, okay, well, how do I crop like correctly and still print it like how I need to print it? It was just something I didn't really understand. So understanding the constraints is important, and knowing the difference between free, of course, that's me getting to just randomly freehand it.
Mm-hmm.
Ratio allows you to put in an existing like ratio from height to width, but you can also do a preset. These are super, super handy.
Wow.
For example, original means it will keep my original ratio. I can't change it. So let's say I know I want to print like a 5x7 or a 4x6. I can put that in here and make sure my crop is exactly what I need for that
Oh.
print. And that's something I didn't know for a while. I tried to like figure it out with my printer and you don't have to do it that way. You can do it in here and size it to what you need. But yeah, it's super handy. But the original will just keep it the original existing ratio of your picture.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you look in here like square, because sometimes, you know, you want square, that 1:1. Sometimes you want it monitor, widescreen. But they even have things like your Facebook profile picture, a Facebook cover, a Facebook post, Instagram, like
Wow.
all these things down here for certain sizes. So that's super neat that you can play with your crop and go with all those presets.
That's nice.
Yeah. And then size, of course, is the pixels. So of course my orientation right now is square by square. So that's telling me my pixels are 1280 by 1280.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense with the size I picked my picture in the beginning. So that's, I could change my pixels. And sometimes like if you're uploading to a website, it says, you know, your picture can't be any bigger than 500 by 500 pixels. And you're like, well, what is that? And so this is where you could enter pixel size.
Oh, nice.
Need a specific thing because some websites are particular.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah. So just some little things about that. You can also mess around with your straightening of a photo, like if you wanted to angle something.
Oh.
So I'm like, yeah, this kind of straight on is nice, but maybe I want to make her appear like she's angled. I don't know. That's how you can mess around with that.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Huh.
Oops. Redo. Of course, because I moved it, I've got some weird background. Okay, there we go. Cropped her a little bit, but that's okay. Okay, so this right here, your cutout mask tool, you can do a lot of neat things with this. I mean, masking is how you would, let's say, have like big bold block letters that say hello with the picture of like a sunset inside of it or something. Like you can crop your pictures to be certain shapes, like a heart, or you can do all sorts of kind of funky different things. You can also remove things, like if you look where it says cut out / mask, like you could remove a background of something to put in a new background. Let's say you took a picture of yourself with a white background or like a green screen style, or it's just solid, but you're like, I want to make it look like I'm sitting in front of the beach. You can then cut out the background and bring in a beach image with this tool. So it's a way to merge things together too. Or create digital collages, because some people like to use this tool not just for photo editing, but for making artworks or collages and different things. So that's how you can cut things out.
Huh.
Or let's say, you know, like for example, I'll give you like a little example. Let's see. So my shape mask. Okay, so this is going to give me a particular shape. So that just cut that out. Whereas this is my magic mask. This is where I can draw a mask. This is my lasso mask. So let's say I'm doing a lasso mask, and I'm just going to do it very, very quickly because, I mean, you don't need to sit and watch me cut something out for 10 minutes. That's not fun. So this is just a loose rendition of what you can do if you slow down. I'm actually like pretty impressed right now. I'm not doing too shabby.
Yeah.
For as quick as I've tried.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just like removed that now. I like cut that out. So what that means is, just for an example, and again, not that you'd like want to actually put this here. Okay. So let's say I've got like these lemons. I can take a selection of them and say edit copy. I can go back in here. I can say edit paste. And now right now they are on top. But if I put them on the bottom, which I have to unlock this, I can put this on the bottom. And now the lemons are where the leaf was. And I can take this, oops. I know it's silly. This is kind of a silly example, but
It's kind of fun.
it is fun, right? I don't know why I keep moving this one now. I keep on trying to move my lemons. But you should be able to move that around. Typically, you'd be able to move it around so you can, you know.
Move the lemon around?
Yeah, you should be able to move it.
Oh, okay.
Let's see here. We've got an empty layer underneath and see if that's what it's going to take. Like I said, some of the functionality is different than Photoshop. Here we go. Maybe I lock this. Then I can, there we go. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So I lock this by clicking and clicked lock.
Okay.
Then I can go down here and I could like move the lemons around,
Okay.
like to get the, you know, part I want. So, and again, not that you'd want lemons where a leaf was, but the idea that you could cut something out with the mask and put something else there.
In there, yeah.
By adding another photo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some cases you'd want to do that, and some cases you're like, why the heck would I want to do that? You know, it's just something to know.
Yes.
More than anything.
That's great.
Yeah, and we've talked about layers a little bit, and layers get confusing. Layers palette is definitely a place that you want to get comfortable with, especially if you're going to have multiple things. If you're just going to have just your photo and you're doing stuff up to what I just showed you now, up till that point, your layers palette is really not that important. But let's say you want to start doing some other things, and just to give you an example, and this little check, this is just viewing it. So this is like a toggle on and off switch for me seeing it. Okay. So when I'm looking at this checkered background, I'm on layer 3. And I can retitle this, like I can call this background. So on my background, and I did show a little bit of this last class, but just kind of a review. But let's say I want like a gradient. Okay, so I made a gradient, and I can pick my colors right here with this little color picker.
That's right.
And then I can, let's say, turn my lemons back on. There's some things you can do in here with, and I can retitle this even and call this lemons. I like to retitle my layers because I feel like it makes it less confusing.
Yes.
If you're gonna have multiple things, for sure. So in your blend mode, and again, I want to make sure I'm on the lemon layer, blend mode, I can do things like multiply, screen, overlay. And when I say blend mode, imagine like paint blending, okay? So you're taking the top layer and the bottom layer and you're merging them together with these different modes. Sometimes they look ridiculous and you'd never ever want to use them, but sometimes you get a cool looking thing. That's kind of funky and neat. That's kind of cool. So again, just if nothing else, I'm just showing you kind of where you could navigate some of these ways to manipulate things. You know, sometimes I use these features, sometimes I don't. It just depends what I'm doing. And some of these, again, are just kind of silly and you might not ever use them. But what I found is sometimes I follow tutorials and step by step, and they have you say, change a blend mode. And if you don't know where to find them, you're like, what? So again, this is just a way to find them. The other thing you can do is you can play with your transparency, so you can have a little bit of that background show through.
Hmm.
And then I can, again, this is so silly. Here, maybe what I'll do, let's delete the lemons and delete this and bring in a new image. Bring in this one. Okay, so if I want to bring this image, so I just went select all, and then I went edit, copy, and then I'm going back into this one, and then I'm going edit, paste. So now I've brought this image of this girl in here, and I have the two pictures. So just to kind of show you some fun things you can do, again, if you have a background, and sometimes I do this with colors, gradients, textures, just different things, you can lower the transparency slightly so you see some of that background color through.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing you can do is come back to these blend modes. And you can play around with these blend modes and create different effects. And so if I come back to my background now, just to show you, let's change colors. So if I'm on my background layer and I turn on my gradient tool, I can put new gradients on and see what they look like in real time. And I can just change directions. I can also come up here and play with some of these gradients if I want like a rainbow effect.
Oh, wow.
Or like a, sunburst. There's a whole bunch of pre-selected ones. It's a little crazy, but these can, just be sort of fun to mess with. And again, maybe you don't want, you can play, ooh, that was crazy. I'll go back to just a little bit with the transparency, right? Because that's going to be a little bit more natural of a look if you just lower transparency slightly. Oops. And again, I can keep switching this around. You just have to make sure you're on the right layer for that.
Right.
So a couple other things I just kind of wanted to talk about was saving too, because that was another thing I was a little bit confused about in the beginning, was saving. So the first thing is, let's say you create an image like this where you have multiple layers. The first thing you need to do is you have to bring that back down to 1. You've got to flatten that back down to 1 and merge it. And once you merge them, you can no longer change those particular edits. Like once I merge this background to the girl here, that's fused. I can't change that anymore. So to do that, you come up here to layer, and you're going to go to flatten image. And when you flatten the image, it puts it all back. So now this is one image. Any edits I make to this will edit it all as a whole again. And then when you go to File, you have your Save option. And when we come up to our Save option, of course, you've got your file name, change. And then you have some file types. So file types, JPEG or JPG, sometimes it's written JPEG, sometimes it's lowercase, sometimes it's all caps. It's all the same. It's referred to as a JPEG. That's how it's referred to. So a JPEG file is your typical photo file. A PNG is kind of like a web file, but it's how you would save it with a clear background. So let's say you have something that you want to be transparent, the background. Like, for example, maybe I wanted this background behind her to be clear and see through. And why would you ever want that? Probably like a website, most likely. That's a PNG file.
Oh, okay. Sure.
And then the web file, this is, again, good for you to save for uploading to Photoshop. And the reason being is, sorry, not Photoshop, Facebook. Facebook typically, or when you upload things to the web, you're not seeing necessarily the full image anyway. Like when you open up a file on your computer straight from the computer, or when you're printing it or looking at it on like a screen like that, it's a different thing. So there's no need for you to upload such a big file, because big files take a long time for websites to load, especially if you're looking at something on your phone. You want things to load quickly, especially like nowadays. It's so silly if you think back to like, I don't know if you ever had America Online or like the dial-up internet. It's like, could you imagine us going back to that now and complaining about how long it takes for things to load? I mean, we're so spoiled, right, with our internet.
Yeah.
But part of that reason is they've developed ways for photos to load fast, and part of that's the file. So if you upload of this version versus the JPEG, it's going to upload a lot faster, say to Facebook or a website or
That's
something
nice.
like that. Yes. But then if you're printing, you don't want to print a web version. You want to print your JPEG, your really nice version. So it's good to know what different file types are for.
Yeah, it is.
PXD, what the heck is that? That is, let's say you want to save a file with all of those layers still as layers. That's the file you would use. Let's say also you have Photoshop and you would like to do something in Pixlr but bring it into Photoshop. You can use this file type. And it's basically like a Photoshop file. So it's all the layers, all the information stays put for you, whereas all these other ones flatten it.
Okay.
So hopefully that kind of makes sense with your file types.
So if you were saying you wanted to save it and come back to do more work on it, would you
Correct.
save it in that version?
Then is this version, correct.
Okay.
And that would only be if you were using layers. Now, sometimes when you're working on things, you're not going to use layers. You might just want some of those other edits and some of those other things I showed you. But if you want to bring filters or fun lighting or go more artsy, typically I start working in layers. So yes, that would be the file you'd want to save it so you could come back to it. Oftentimes I will say this too, if I have a file with layers, I often keep a version with layers and then keep a flattened version. Because if I ever want to go back to it or change it or manipulate it, it's like, unless you've got that file, you can't.
Okay. Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah. Let me see, we've got a few more minutes. I do want to show you a couple other fun things I like to do in the filter gallery. One of my favorite tools is the vignette tool.
Hey, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like, you keep saying about saving this. Now, it saves it on the web, or does it save it on your computer?
That's a great question. It will save it on your computer. You will download it back to your computer.
It automatically does that?
Yes. So here, I'll walk you through this. Let me show you.
Well, when you loaded, you had some already saved. I wasn't sure if they were saved on the website or from your computer that somehow got there.
Great question. So when you Pixlr, when you open it back up on your same computer, it'll show you your most recent files and allow you to click them and pull them back up. But I always will, because Pixlr is a web-based photo editor, unlike GIMP or some of the other ones that you can download to your actual hard drive, you will always technically download it back to your computer. So if I say, okay, just sample this, okay, here's all my settings.
Right.
I click download, and right down here, this puts it back on my computer for me. And now it said it was downloaded. So it was saved to my download folder on my device.
Okay.
So then, just for example, if I close this out, so right here, this is just my history. So when I go back to Pixlr, it shows me my most recent history, and it will allow me to click it and open it back up.
Okay.
But I always save it when I'm done and download it through that process just in case, because I don't trust that that's going to necessarily be there. But I will say every time I've used Pixlr, it has been. But, you know, it's like it being a web-based program, I just wouldn't want to rely on that, if that makes sense.
Right.
Just to be safe.
Just to be safe, exactly. And that's the kind of the same, you know, sometimes I save multiple versions of stuff. I've had big projects that I've worked on where I just would save versions along the way. Version 1, work on it for another few hours, save it as version 2, work on it for another few hours. Because if you lose a version, then you can at least go back and have a previous version of it. So I don't do that with photos like this, but I've done it with like big like art pieces I've made like in Photoshop, or like digital collages and things where I'm doing lots of cutting and lots of selecting and deleting and adding. And there's tons and tons of layers. So then I'll save multiple versions. But this filter right here, there are a lot of fun things you can do, but there's a lot of other silly, crazy things you can do, just like some of those other tools. It's like you could push it too much of a good thing. But the vignette is one I really like. And vignettes are simple. They're just that kind of hug on the border of your picture of the like little bit of a darkness.
Oh, yeah.
And so, or lightness. So if I move it to the right, see how it just darkens my edges for me? And here's my before, here's my after. Now, I like a vignette for the purpose of it draws your eye inward to me a little bit. I wouldn't necessarily use a vignette on this particular picture just because it's so zoomed into her face, but vignettes where there's more of edge around like a portrait of a person, I think it's really nice because again, it just pushes your eye inward. And then you can also lighten too. So you can go opposite, which, you know, actually that's kind of neat on this one. And then there's your before, there's your after. So there could be a time and place that you'd want to do the vignette, but you can find that under filter. And there's some other fun things you can play, but just to kind of show you real quick, it's like you can do crazy things. Like here's a mosaic.
Oh.
You know what I mean? It's like you can do artsy things. So again, I typically don't use those things when I'm doing photos. So, but it is 6, but I just, you know, are there any